Earlier this year, popular atheist Alex O'Connor went on the Jubilee podcast with 20 Christians. He asked the following question.
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with sufferings. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
What Alex O'Connor brought up is called the problem of evil, one of the most common objections to God. More specifically, he's talking about the problem of suffering or animal suffering, in order to escape many of the common Christian responses. But what he probably wasn't expecting was the response you're about to see.
The thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals and the existence of God. So my value theory says that the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them, it's about the total timeline of their life and where their life permanently ends. The end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they lived. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for.
The most important thing is not what happens, but the total timeline. What Tim introduced is a suffer-based approach to the problem of evil. The suffer-based approach is far less talked about than the event-based approach. The event-based approach deals primarily with higher-order goods that come from suffering. For example, suffering gives people the opportunity to actually be courageous or compassionate. If there was no suffering, these stronger character traits could not arise. The suffer-based approach, however, deals with how each individual chooses to defeat suffering by integrating into their existence, as Tim discussed. The event-based approach deals with suffering on a case-by-case basis. Each event of suffering is judged on whether it can produce those goods, while the suffer-based approach allows suffering to be integrated as the sufferer themselves chooses. The justification for suffering comes either from the opportunity inherent to suffering or its intrinsic redeemability. While the event-based approach is valuable, without considering the role of integration, the theist is liable to examples of suffering like the one about the deer that Alex presented, where there is no sign of good that results from the suffering. Now that we have discussed how the suffer-based approach treats events of suffering, let's consider how to talk about how the suffer-based approach changes the discussion of God's role. I'm going to analyze this by pointing out two shifts that often come up in conversations like these. These are shifts from moral justifications for allowing evil to the psychological motivation behind it. The other is shifting from discussing characteristics of suffering to the amount of suffering. Let's get into the first one. You know this shift has taken place when it goes from asking, is it okay for God to do this, to why would God do this? If someone is plausibly justified in doing something, then even if you don't know why, it's irrelevant to challenge the innocence of that person on what their motivation is. The same goes for God. If God offers all creatures, including in the afterlife, the chance to integrate their suffering so that they are satisfied with the whole timeline of their lives, this gives a worthy moral justification, so we don't need to give a motivation in order to escape the problem of suffering. The other shift is between the qualities of suffering, such as extreme or unnecessary, to the amount of suffering there is. Alex does this in his conversation with Tim.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on.
If we grant Alex's hypothetical, what then? Would he be satisfied with just getting rid of carnivores, or is there more he would need to see for the problem to be answered? Talking about the amount of suffering gets you into hazy territory and prone to being bombarded with examples. But if you can address the types of suffering, then no matter how many instances there are, the problem is answered. So, let's talk about those attributes. The conversation around the problem of evil, centered around the event-based approach, finds its biggest challenge with unnecessary, also called gratuitous suffering. Those sufferings where the greater goods can't be identified. However, if we consider the suffer-based approach and its value theory, we can accept just as much as a skeptic would, that sometimes you can't figure out the reason for suffering, and be okay with that, because the main attribute of suffering to consider is the intrinsic redeemability. If all suffering can be redeemed, then it doesn't matter how much there is. It's been defeated. If you want to respond to this, you need to consider where the burden of proof lies. The problem of evil and problem of suffering is an internal critique, meaning the skeptic must step inside the Christian worldview, the whole worldview, and not just a part of it, and find a contradiction. The skeptic must show that particular sufferings cannot be defeated or integrated by the individual sufferer. Of course, this seems impossible since you can't know what one person will or won't be able to accept. But since the challenge of a contradiction existing is a positive claim, this must be met by the skeptic for the problem to maintain. Alternatively, they could try to disprove the value theory as a whole and show that offering creatures the ability of integration to triumph over their suffering is incompatible with a perfectly loving God. And that's it. If you enjoyed, I'd appreciate a like or subscription. And if you didn't, keep the conversation going in the comments. And oh, by the way, live by the way.